No, it was a rotten system. But I don't know how we get from that to reparations. I mean, what we see in the United States in terms of the bad things, you see all around the world. If you were to give reparations to everyone whose ancestors had been slaves, I suspect that you would have to give reparations to more than half the entire population of the globe. Slavery was not confined to one set of races. I suspect that most of the people who were either slaves or slave owners around the world were neither white nor black. I mean, this was a universal curse of the human species.
Africa, the Middle East, Asia,
slavery
took place everywhere.
And it continued elsewhere long after it was abolished in the Western countries. The other thing, I have a slight sidebar in there on the history of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
The history of slavery existed all over the world for thousands of years among all sorts of people, as far back as the history of the human species goes. It's one of many evils that the left tries to localize, when in fact it is a universal evil. But more than that, as much as slavery is repudiated around the world today, prior to the 18th century, I know of no serious effort to abolish the institution anywhere. Anywhere.
Not in Africa, not in the Arabian
world. Not
in
Africa in the 21st century. Adam Smith wrote in 1776 that the only place in the world where slavery had been abolished completely was Western Europe. And so this was
as late as the year this country was founded.
Yes. And so the idea that this is something that the United States had that nobody else had, or other countries that didn't have, it's been estimated that there are more slaves in India than in the entire Western Hemisphere. And that's before and after Columbus got here. And the situation is wholly different. And yet, if you read the data, for example, from London, the educational tests and so forth, you see that there, immigrants from Africa pass this test they have. I'm talking about low-income people now. Nearly 60% of the time. Blacks from Caribbean, like 50%, so on. Native-born whites in the same low-income bracket pass this test 30% of the time. And it's the same thing. The foreign people come in, they haven't had generations of being steeped in the welfare state vision, the vision of grievances, victimology, and resentments, the idea that there are enemies out there dedicated to keeping you down. That's the message that's been pumped into the head of the white lower class in Britain, and that's the image that's been pumped into the black low-income people in the United States, and the results are the same in both cases.
And Christoph had ascribed the gaps between African Americans and whites in America, gaps in wealth, gaps in educational achievement, the usual gaps, to, and this is a quotation from Christoph, to the lingering effects of slavery, close quote.
Oh, yes.
And here's Tom Sowell, quote, "If we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state. In other words, we could compare hard evidence on the legacy of slavery with hard evidence on the legacy of liberals."
One of my favorite statistic in there is that the poverty rate among blacks as a whole is 22%.
Mm-hmm.
Among whites as a whole is 11%. And among black married couples is 7.5%. So and black married couples have never had a poverty rate as high as 10% in any year since 1994.
All right. So to the cry, what is to be done? Tom Sowell answers,
it's been done.
Get an education, get married, have kids after you get married. That's sort of the answer, right?
Well, yes, and the things that work for other people tend to work pretty generally. In terms of political leaders, all the incentives politically are for black leaders to blame all problems in the black community on the larger society. And that enables them to take on the role of being the defender of the black community against enemies, which in turn creates the situation in which many blacks don't feel that anything that they do is going to help themselves unless it's done politically as a group. That there's no point. I mean, why would you, if you believe what they say, why would you want to knock yourself out in school knowing that the man is not going to let you get anywhere? One of the most pathetic things I heard in recent years was a young black man saying that, at one point he thought he would join the Air Force and become a pilot. And then he says he realized that the white man is not going to let a black man become a pilot. And he was saying this decades after the Tennessee Airmen had established their reputation in combat in Europe. But the hopelessness is one of the big products of the race industry. That you have no chance. I remember giving a talk at Marquette, and at the end of the talk, among the questions that was asked, a young black man got up and he said, "Even though I am graduating from Marquette University, what hope is there for me?" And having gone through college when I was in the 50s, I don't remember any blacks saying that in the 1950s, when there was a lot more obstacles to overcome than there were when this guy is graduating from Marquette. But you have to produce that kind of feeling in order to serve the interests of those in the race industry.
How do you make something of yourself as an African American in America today?
The way anybody else would. You equip yourself with skills that people are willing to pay for.
I want to go back and revisit this blog I did on the Watchmen TV series, which aired back in 2019 on HBO just before the presidential election. I uploaded the blog in 2020, and in it, I talk about essentially how the race hustlers and the race industry is putting out this entertainment that we watch, and of course, controlling the mainstream news. And, these individuals, these powerful, corrupt individuals in government, these race hustlers, they use the entertainment to program us and to prepare us to respond to events which they are creating and passing off as organic because they own the news and they own all of the media. So we have to realize the power of the enemy that we face, and how one of their greatest skills is their psychological manipulation, how they manufacture our consent, how they sort of get us to walk right through their trap, seemingly willfully, because we're just sleepwalking through it all. So this is why it's very important to deconstruct the psychology of how this all works. And we see that in the Watchmen movie that came out a few years back, the only real superhero with superpowers in that whole show is Dr. Manhattan, this blue guy here, okay, played by Billy Crudup, a white guy, all right? Now, this character for the TV series was turned black. He's a black character now. And I guess we're supposed to think that we're just supposed to go, well, why not? Why can't, the character turn black? He can turn into any form he wants. He can turn into an animal if he wants, but he chooses to be black. But if you think about it, this was an election year, and we have the main superhero with godly powers who has just turned black. Actually, it's a black man who turned blue. And if you think about the politics behind that, a black man turning blue and getting godly powers. And who else gets godly powers at the end of the show? Angela Abar, the main character, the main masked vigilante in the show, Sister Knight. It is heavily suggested that she gets the powers of Dr. Manhattan at the end of the show. So, black man turns into a god by turning blue, and essentially a black woman turns into God by turning blue as well. So in other words, if you turn blue, you're going to have the powers that were previously held by the white man. Okay? And what political party does the color blue represent? And who's being made to look like racist, neo-Nazi characters? There's a plan here, to manipulate the population into voting a certain way, to align themselves a certain way, and there's a plan to persecute a certain political class. This show is just one small example of how this is done covertly through entertainment. So in the original Watchmen story, the character of Hooded Justice is the mythical, original, first hooded vigilante. Now, these people, they don't have superpowers. They're just humans with extraordinary abilities who decide to take justice into their own hands. They're vigilantes. And this character, Hooded Justice, is decidedly white. Although we don't know who he is, he doesn't take off his hood. We can see that his skin underneath the hood is white. He's got blue eyes. And apparently he speaks in a some type of European accent and expresses sympathies towards that are, leaning towards the Nazis, leaning towards anti-Semitic sentiment. So this is not just assumed to be a white person underneath the hood, but a far right, extremist white person. So in the HBO series, this character here, for some brilliant reason, is revealed to be a black man, which makes sense in a way, in a really twisted way, and does kind of go along with the whole sadomasochistic, self-loathing, self-hating personality of Will Reeves, this black character who ends up being Hooded Justice. And you can see in the show, he's painting his face white so that he appears white, so that the people he protects, the people who attempted to lynch him, the people who killed his parents in the Tulsa race riot massacre, which is depicted in the beginning of the show. The whole show begins with a reenactment of the Tulsa race massacre. So, I mean, the entire show is built upon the scars of this horrible, most divisive aspect of American history. So, they're launching from a point of absolute divisiveness. If you think about it, if you can pick the most controversial episode in American history, other than the American Revolution, where we basically told the Brits to go screw themselves and get out of here. Other than that, we're talking the emancipation of black slaves, right, and the whole Jim Crow era. This is a very divisive point in history. It's in the past. We shouldn't forget it because we're doomed to repeat it if we ignore it. But at the same time, this show is kind of wallowing in fetishizing this man's self-loathing and his torture, and he commemorates the lynching of black men by wearing a noose around his neck. So everything he does, he carries that with him. He carries this old wound with him and tears it open with every fight. Now, the first time I heard of lynching and this whole ugly era of human history was, I was in class and they showed us this picture. And it's incomprehensible to a young mind that there would be this group of people that are gathering and smiling as if they're going to, see a show or a play or something. But there's these dead people hanging. It's just, aside from the fact that it's just pure racial hatred, just the fact that anyone would gather in a celebratory manner, beneath two dead bodies of any race is just, it's so incomprehensibly awful to a young mind who's never been exposed to that type of violence. So, and everyone in the classroom, I don't know what kind of ethnic background your classmates had, but I was in an ethnically diverse classroom where there were a lot of different races. And we all looked at each other different after that day. We didn't look at each other the same. So this had a profound impact on our young minds. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't tell young people about this ugly era of history in America, but I do think it's important how we deliver this information. We shouldn't just throw it in their faces and go, hey, look, isn't that horrible? That's awful, isn't it? And just rub it in their faces and throw nooses on their tables and go, remember, don't forget what you did, what your ancestors did. You're guilty. You deserve reparations. You're guilty. You deserve reparations. You see, this can be used to manipulate people by their emotions in nefarious ways. You can appear to pander to one particular racial group. Say, hey, you deserve reparations. Hey, you deserve to suffer. You deserve to pay for what your great-great-grandfather did. You see? So they will pander to certain groups and exploit the guilt that other groups feel purely for political aim, to get you to vote their person in office by painting them as sympathetic to you, to your cause, and paint another political group as being an extension of the people that did this here, when the truth may not be that may not be the case at all in reality. They need to use the media and the entertainment to create a false reality or a highly exaggerated reality. Once you buy into it, they use you to get their political agenda through. And then when it's all over, they dispose of you, or you find yourself in a situation where you have less freedom than you had before it all started. So the part of the story that is set in the modern day, which would be 2019, when we were actually watching the show as it came out, we find that Hooded Justice is an old man now. Will Reeves, played by Lou Gossett Jr., and we find out that he's Angela Abar's grandfather. And he's the one who's actually hypnotizing Don Johnson, using mind control techniques to get Don Johnson to commit suicide, to hang himself from a noose. And we just talked about the noose and lynching and how controversial that is. So they're making a direct reference to the history of hate crimes and lynching against blacks. And they're tying it directly into the plot of this racially heated story. And there's a link directly to America's racist past by way of Don Johnson's character, because he is secretly part of the 7th Cavalry, which is basically a new version of the Ku Klux Klan. And he is part of a conspiracy to bring about a new, racially based order in society. And Angela Abar, who thought he was a good man, didn't know he was racist, finds a Ku Klux Klan outfit in one of his closets after he's dead. This is a black man who suffered terrible racial hatred and abuse from the white man, exacting revenge upon the white man. And we're behind him because Don Johnson, Judd Crawford, is a scumbag. He is a two-faced racist. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that this is a fantasy, okay? This is basically revenge porn, okay? And we have to ask ourselves, why is this piece of entertainment so interested in riling up our racial emotions in such a very specific way? And the noose as a symbol is a very important trigger in all of this. So after the Watchmen TV series is done delivering its racially divisive, morally ambiguous tale that somehow is just unanimously applauded by mainstream media and awarded, after the series concludes in October of 2019, we come to 2020 and we get to the murder of George Floyd, which triggered off a lot of racial division in society, and the media just fanned the flame, just to make it as to maximize the damage and the pain felt by this incident as much as possible, rather than try and de-escalate things and sort of acknowledge that, hey, this is terrible, but let's keep our heads straight here. Let's not get out of hand, all right? They just fan the flames. And if you remember, the NASCAR driver, Bubba Wallace, according to Wikipedia here, began to speak out about the abuse of African Americans by police, becoming the face of stock car racing's involvement in the Black Lives Matter movement. So he was a race car driver. Race. Think about that word, race. Kind of interesting. Now, Bubba Wallace isn't necessarily all black. He's half white. Look how white his father is. Same thing with Colin Kaepernick. He's not all black either. He's part white. You can look at his skin. You can see that he's not completely black. And the reason I'm making this point, in Brazil, they might call someone like this mulatto. Just means they're mixed, means they're half. Okay, but America is obsessed with blackness. to almost to a fault, where we're fetishizing blackness. And I'm not saying that it's bad to compliment someone for their beautiful features, okay? But the thing is, when we put someone on a pedestal because of an accident of birth, and we use it to benefit our political narrative when it's convenient, and we ignore the part that we don't like, the white half or whatever part of the person's race that doesn't benefit or forward our political agenda, that's a form of racism, okay? So I just thought I would point out the obvious before going forward here in regard to that. After Bubba Wallace starts speaking out about, racism, we have the incident with the Noose. On June 21st, 2020, a member of Wallace's team reported to NASCAR that a noose had been placed in Wallace's garage stall at Talladega Superspeedway, which NASCAR President Steve Phelps relayed to Wallace in the evening. The organization condemned the act as heinous and said they would consult with law enforcement. Wallace stated that he was incredibly saddened by the painful reminder of how much further we have to go as a society and how persistent we must be in the fight against racism. So you see what they're doing there? They're taking the past, taking America's racist history, the worst aspects of it, and involving a noose, okay, which as a symbol conjures up that picture, the one we looked at earlier, lynching. So he's bringing all this up. He's really making a big deal about this, all right? This is a big deal. Now, you don't accuse someone of murder or racism or hate crime lightly. It's not something you want to do lightly, because if you're wrong about it, you've done a lot of damage to that person, their reputation, and you've made society unnecessarily paranoid. Okay, so this is during the heated racial air of the George Floyd incident, and he's calling this something that we need to look at as an example of how much racism still exists in America. The problem is it was all fake. A day after the race, an investigation by the FBI concluded that Wallace was not the victim of a hate crime. The alleged noose was a pull-down rope with a loop in the style of a hangman's knot that was located on an overhead door and had been in the garage since the fall Talladega race in 2019. The FBI's determination led to people criticizing Wallace on social media as fake and questioning his integrity, as they should have, because that's quite damaging to make such accusations and to operate on false assumptions and to fan the flames of a racially heated environment that needs de-escalation. If you're de-escalating a situation, it means you're for peace, putting your good foot forward. If you're fanning the flames based on false information, that makes you a bad guy. You're not helping things. You're making things worse. And that's exactly what Bubba Wallace was doing. Wallace stated in interviews that although he was relieved that he was not specifically targeted, he was frustrated by the backlash he received. Oh, poor Bubba Wallace. What, you don't want any, he makes himself out to be a victim under false pretenses, false assumptions. And then when he's called out, he makes himself the victim again by, oh, well, don't get angry at me for, fanning the flames of racial division in society. He deserves every ounce of that. We need accountability when things like this happen. He deserves all the shit he gets and more, because it's very dangerous. People go out and murder and fight. The violence gets increased when people like him say things like this. And I think that's the point. Just like the Watchmen series, it's about stirring up emotions of racial divisiveness and getting people divided and pissing them off. It's not about, fighting racism. It's about encouraging it. Another event, which does not involve a noose, but was clearly orchestrated by the race hustlers using both entertainment and the news media combined, two-prong approach. In this case, we have Jussie Smollett, who in 2015 portrayed musician Jamal Lyon in the Fox drama series Empire, a role that was hailed as groundbreaking for its positive depiction of a black gay man on television. Okay, so notice they're saying he depicted a black gay man. Does he look black to you? Well, yes, he looks partially black, but he's obviously mixed race. So again, they're putting him on a pedestal and fetishizing the part of him that is black, and they're ignoring the other racial characteristics that he obviously has because, well, that's not important. It's not important if he's part white or part Jewish or whatever else he is. What's important is that he's part black, and that's what we need to focus on, and let's just ignore the rest. And they do this because they want to use black people in America. They want to use them as foot soldiers to get their political agendas through. And it's not enough just to get black people. If they can take these people who are part black, who are racially mixed, and get them to represent blacks and get us to view them as blacks and get everyone to file behind them, well, now you've got more non-blacks involved because they're identifying more with this guy. They're saying, oh, well, he's part this and part that, so I should get behind him too. So they're using these mixed race individuals to help rally more people behind their false paid role models that they put up in front of us. In January 2019, Smollett staged a fake hate crime against himself in Chicago and later made false police reports regarding the incident. In December 2021, Smollett was convicted of 5 felony counts of disorderly conduct. He was sentenced in March 2022 to 150 days in county jail. He has since been released on bond while his case is on appeal. Okay, so look, the story first ran in January of 2019, so that was before the Watchmen series came out, and before the George Floyd incident, and before the Bubba Wallace incident. It took until December of 2021 for him to finally get convicted. So you see, between January 2019 and December 2020, the media just runs with the story and rallies behind Smollett and uses it as an excuse and as an example of, oh, the great racism that still exists in society and hate crimes are still happening, and they just blow it up to death. And that's where the damage is done. That's where people, that's where the division is sown. And at the end of the day, once the damage is all done and nobody cares about the story anymore because, a lot of Americans don't have a very long attention span and the media knows this, by the time that's all over, then they go, oh, oops, yeah, that was fake. It was all false. But, there's no accountability. Nobody in the media goes, oh, we're sorry for, some of the negativity that we may have sown running with this false story. This is what they do. The media will lie and they will run with it during a time that it's convenient in order to get their person elected or to get their measure passed or to get the people behind them enough to where they can get it through. And then the lies come out later after the damage is already done. This happens all the time. If you go to this article in thenetline.com, it says, what we know about Jussie Smollett's parents. All right, this is what we know. Yet there's not one picture of the father in there. There's only a picture of his mother, who we can see is clearly a black woman, because that's the only thing that's important. And this is after he was convicted, by the way. So, look at this. Jussie's mother fostered her children's love for performance and activism. This is after he was already convicted. This is March 16, 2022. So you see the media, after this man falsely claims a hate crime and is exposed and is convicted, the media is still presenting him as this angel. Like, oh, he's the son of a wonderful black woman and civil rights activist. You see, like, they won't admit that he's a shithead. They just can't do it because they spent too much time putting him on a pedestal and they can't back down. So they have to keep running with the false assumptions about him. Janet, his mother, is African-American, and Joel was a Russian Jew, was a Russian-Polish Jew who didn't like people referring to him as white. Do you see that there? Yeah, that's cool. You don't want people referring to you as something you're not, but it's just kind of strange. It's the assumption being like, oh yeah, white is bad. Don't accuse me of that. But here's a picture of him, okay? And it's just strange. It's, now anyone can convert to Judaism and call themselves a Jew. If you were German and had blue eyes and, during World War II, and a Nazi came up to you and said, show us your papers or whatever, and you said, I identify as Jewish, well, I don't think they'd say that's cool. I think they'd probably execute you just the same. So, I mean, and we don't really know a whole lot about Jussie Smollett's father. If you look it up, there's not a lot you can find out about his origins. So what I'm saying is the fact that he was a Polish Jew doesn't necessarily mean he wasn't white at all. The fact that he didn't like being called white, that doesn't constitute any sort of proof that he wasn't white at all. You can look at him, you can see. I think what it comes down to is, it's important to people who need a political agenda to be pushed through, who need to use race to drive their political agenda. Skin color is much more important to those individuals, the race hustlers, than it is to everyone else. And they give the false idea that it is that important. And so we start fighting with each other and becoming more racist as a result of these stories, the way they're presented, the way the media presents these actors, the way they, put race on a pedestal, the way they fetishize racial features and kind of demonize others. Now, this is a story that ran June 3rd of this year, okay? So this is recent. Does that look familiar to you? Think about everything we've been talking about. Using lynching imagery to get votes disrespects black people living and dead. Thank you for someone finally telling the truth on a mainstream news outlet. Again, it is opinion, so they're not presented as fact, obviously, but just to see some truth stated is kind of refreshing. You know why? Because they had to. Because look at this. He ran this ad, people freaked out, and he immediately pulled this picture. You couldn't find this for a while. But so many people were talking about it and going, hey, what's up with that? They had to start talking about it. They were forced to talk about it because too many people were saying, hey, that's BS. In a new online campaign ad, Democrat Charles Booker, a black man running for U.S. Senate in Kentucky, makes the horrible decision to wear a noose as he accuses the incumbent, Rand Paul, a white Republican, of blocking a bill to make lynching a federal hate crime. In addition to the awfulness of wearing a noose, Booker's ad is misleading. Paul voted against the legislation in 2020, but he co-sponsored and voted for the version of the bill signed into law by President Joe Biden in March. So, they tried to paint Rand Paul as this horrible white supremacist who didn't think that we should make lynching a federal hate crime. But it becomes clear that Rand Paul does not approve of lynching. He doesn't think lynching is good. He's not racist. He just didn't like the way that particular bill was arranged. For whatever reason, you can look into that. But he then co-sponsored and voted for a revised version. So, I mean, if he was this Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi type, why would he sponsor any version of it? Why would he vote for any version of it? So you see, they tried to mix this all up and confuse people and create, a neo-Nazi politician character and create a victim where it was all just fake. It was all just fakery. The race hustlers at work. This is very destructive for society and relations between the races, and it's all done on purpose by the mainstream. So the Watchmen TV series ends in 2019, but during that series introduces the idea of reparations being given to those black individuals in the modern day in 2019, the time that you're watching the show. Reparations for those who can prove they have a genetic link to someone who was the victim of Jim Crow laws or slavery. And how you quantify that, how you prove that, and how you decide what is proper compensation. I don't know how that all works, but that sounds like a hell of a can of worms. So anyway, you see it introduced in a fictional context in a show that is presumably entertainment. And less than a year later, we see it introduced into reality by Governor Gavin Newsom, who signs a reparations bill into law on September 30th, 2020, about a year after the Watchmen series aired. So you see, the people who are making our entertainment are the same individuals behind government, and they plan this stuff ahead, and they prepare you for it by putting it in the entertainment and seeing how you respond and seeing how they need to roll it out into reality. Okay? Now, Gavin Newsom, thousands of Californians signed a petition to recall this guy. So whether you believe that he rightfully survived the recall or not, whether you believe that he cheated or not. The fact is, many thousands of Californians signed a bill to recall him, which shows that they don't really want him there. Okay, a large percentage of Californians do not want him in this position. Okay, and the news media will do their best to show that, oh, well, those are the extreme people, those are the white supremacists, and Gavin Newsom, he's just a corrupt politician, flat out. And he's not doing this to make life better for anybody. He's doing it because he's being told to do it, and he just does. He's just a puppet for the evil individuals who just want to divide and conquer.
Well, I'll tell you, this is really a troublesome area. The whole concept of reparations. I do a pretty deep dive in the new book, but you have to recognize that maybe there are some other factors that are involved in some of the discrepancies that exist between the races. When you look at wealth, for instance, yes, there is a wealth gap, 5 to 10x wealth gap. But if you look at Ghanaians and Nigerians, people who have black skins, who live in this country, there's little or no wealth gap. Now, I wonder why that is. If you go and you study those families, you'll find that a bachelor's degree is the baseline. That's where you start.
That's
and
right.
There's a tremendous emphasis on the family and family structure and faith. Those things make a big difference. And if you take traditional Black American families who have those same values, there's very little wealth gap there too. So I wonder if perhaps we're looking at the wrong things. We're trying to blame somebody else. If you believe you're a victim, you are a victim. And, you think things like critical race theory, the 1619 Project, all of those things that try to get Black people to feel like they're victims. They try to get white people to feel guilty. The advantage of making white people feel guilty is then you can defund the police, you can put dangerous criminals out, you can leave the southern border unguarded, and nobody will say anything. They'll just hang their head and hope you don't call them a nasty name. These are not things that should be going on, in America. They just aren't the right kinds of things to happen. And, when you look at the advantages of this nation, I have a friend and a neighbor in Florida. He was born in the Cape Verde Islands. This was like the staging area where the whole slave trade started.
Yeah.
Off of the western coast of Africa. And, he had to go down to the creek and take buckets of water out in the morning. That's the kind of poverty he grew up in. Came here as like a 9 or 10-year-old, excelled in school, and today is a billionaire.
Yeah.
Black skin.
Well, exactly.
This is not to say that all our problems have been resolved. They have not. And I
Right.
do a deep analysis of that. But let's look at the correct things. Let's look at family structure. Let's look at our faith. Look at those things that are deteriorating in our society. Look at the things that the Marxist leaders said would take down America and see how those things are happening. That's what we need to be looking at. There's a reason we have these brains.
I'm trying to get away from YouTube and Google in general. I don't support their censorship or their surveillance, things like this. So I would appreciate if you would go to Rumble and support me there. Once I have enough followers on Rumble, I am going to be leaving the YouTube platform. So the sooner the better. And you'll find me there as Joe Gilmore without the E at the end. And you can send feedback to tinfoilhatfashion@protonmail.com. That is my email address.